So, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are in the West. And welcome to the Population Health Research Network's Webinar Wednesdays, which is kindly hosted by the ARDC, who are providing the webinar platform for us. This is the second of our Wednesday lunchtime webinars by researchers who've used the PHRN network to assist with their data linkage and research projects. This week, I'd like to introduce you to Kate Miller, who's a PhD student with the Telethon Kids Institute. And I'm particularly delighted that Kate's agreed to present today, as she worked for the PHRN Program Office as our training coordinator prior to starting her PhD. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's been up to in the last few years. Kate will be talking about the topic, is low sun exposure during early life a risk factor for type 1 diabetes? At the end of the presentation, we'll take some questions. You can type your questions into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can type those questions in any time, and then we'll ask Kate the questions at the end of the presentation. So welcome, and I'm going to hand over to Kate now.
Hi, my name's Kate Miller and I'm a student of the University of Western Australia and the Telethon Kids Institute in Perth, Western Australia. Today I'll be talking about my PhD project that looked at type 1 diabetes and ultraviolet radiation. I'll first provide a background and then discuss the three key data linkage studies that made up my PhD. We've come such a long way in our treatment of type 1 diabetes, and yet its prevention still eludes us. Multiple studies, however, have now confirmed that type 1 diabetes risk can be identified prior to symptomatic disease through the presence of 2 or more diabetes-related islet autoantibodies. Importantly, these antibodies can be detected from as early as 3 months of age, with a peak between 9 and 24 months. The lifetime risk of developing symptomatic type 1 diabetes approaches 100% once 2 or more of these islet autoantibodies are detected in at-risk children. The ability now to predict type 1 diabetes risk through screening prior to symptomatic disease has really heightened interest in identifying interventions that may delay disease progression, and has also really put the spotlight on the gestation period and first year of life as an important window of opportunity to prevent islet autoimmunity and ultimately prevent type 1 diabetes. So my PhD is looking into whether there's an association between ultraviolet radiation and type 1 diabetes risk in Western Australian children, and whether UVR may be able to play a role in delaying disease onset and or reducing the severity of disease presentation. So why UV? Recent intervention studies from other autoimmune disorders such as multiple sclerosis and more recently eczema have demonstrated an association between higher UV exposure and lower incidence of disease that's independent of vitamin D. And there's 3 worthy clues that give us hope that higher UV exposure may lower the incidence of type 1 diabetes also. Firstly, the incidence of type 1 diabetes has increased in the past decade at a rate that's too great to be solely attributed to increasing genetic risk. This is further supported by the fact that worldwide we've seen a reduction in the proportion of children who are presenting with type 1 diabetes with known high-risk HLA genotypes. So this suggests some kind of environmental or external trigger. Interestingly, we've seen that the incidence of type 1 diabetes generally increases with latitude or distance from the equator, and we also see higher rates of disease onset in winter months when we compare with any other months of the year. One potential environmental factor that varies by both latitude and season is ultraviolet radiation. UV exposure has become of increasing interest over the past decade because of its immunoregulatory actions, which are mediated through the production of vitamin D, cis-urocanic acid, nitric oxide, and other pathways. So UVR can be measured in a number of ways and with varying levels of accuracy. Long-term exposure can be measured by silicon casts of back of hand skin to objectively measure actinic damage. And short-term exposure is measured by electronic UVR dosimeters, sun behaviour diaries, or blood 25 hydroxyvitamin D, also known as 25-OHD, which is your major circulating metabolite of vitamin D. So your 25-OHD levels reflect both sun exposure as well as dietary intake through a limited number of foods and supplements. However, for many diseases, we're actually interested in the UVR exposure of particular life stages, which is inherently more difficult to measure. So studies have traditionally relied on self-reported past sun behaviour or exposure, which in some instances is over decades in the past, which can obviously be either inaccurate or unreliable. So more recently, we've seen that NASA satellite data of erythemal UV dose is being used as a proxy for an individual's UVR exposure. UVR dose are calculated using the UV irradiance reaching the surface of the Earth and then weighted by a model value of susceptibility of Caucasian skin to sunburn. So these data are date and geographically specific, so it provides a daily dose for each degree of latitude and longitude throughout the world, thus providing a far finer spatio-temporal scale than latitude and also accounts for seasonal changes. Such data are perfect for data linkage studies because they enable large-scale retrospective studies to be conducted in a cost-effective and efficient manner. So the aims of my PhD were to determine whether higher erythemal UV dose during the gestational period, so maternal exposure, and the first year of life are associated with subsequent decreased risk of type 1 diabetes in childhood. And then to investigate the associations between 25-OHD levels at diagnosis and type 1 diabetes risk, age of onset, and severity of presentation. Although one of the benefits of erythemal UV dose is that it's an objective measure of UVR, it doesn't actually measure an individual's true exposure. So that is, it doesn't account for how much time an individual may spend in the sun, and it also doesn't take into account their sun protective behaviours. And within the selected administrative data sets that we were planning on using for our linkage study, we didn't have any information on participants' sun behaviours or their sun protective behaviours. So when I first set out to do this project, the first question that everybody asked me was, well, how do you know that the erythemal UV dose has any reflection at all on how much sun exposure a person actually gets? As a result, the first critical step for our study was to establish the relationship between erythemal UV dose and serum 25-OHD levels during pregnancy and at different gestational ages to assess whether the NASA measure that we were planning on using was in fact a valid proxy for an individual's sun exposure. And so this became Study 1. So the aim of this study was to validate the use of satellite-derived erythemal UV dose as a proxy for personal sun exposure as measured by 25-OHD levels during pregnancy and identify critical life stage of exposure for type 1 diabetes as well as for several other diseases. So the objectives of the study was to determine what number of days prior to blood draw UVR best predicted 25-OHD levels, and then using linked data determine what the best predictive model was using only administrative data. So this was a retrospective cross-sectional study. So participants were women aged between 18 and 44 years who'd had their serum 25-OHD tested by PathWest between January 2000 and December 2014, either in the 90 days prior to pregnancy or throughout pregnancy, and whose pregnancy resulted in a birth in Western Australia. So data were drawn from 5 data sets. So the PathWest data set is a statewide data set, and PathWest is the only public pathology service in Western Australia. So it counts for approximately 80% of all pathology samples collected in WA. So from the PathWest data set, we obtained data on the 25-OHD measurement, the date of sample collection, and the participant's residential postcode at the time of sample collection. The Midwives Notification System is an administrative data set established under the Authority of the Health Regulations 1994, which is complete for over 99% of all births in Western Australia. The MNS provided us with data on a large range of covariates that we used in our multiple regression analyses for the development of the predictive model. So covariates included ethnicity, maternal age, gestational age, parity, smoking, pregnancy complications, medical conditions, birth order, and plurality. The linkage of the PathWest dataset and the Midwives Notification System was conducted by the West Australian Data Linkage Branch, and then we used the date of sample collection and the latitude and the longitude coordinates of the centroid of each participant's postcode to merge daily UVR data from the NASA Satellite Archive, temperature data, so both daily minimum and daily maximum from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, and then socioeconomic status data from and the remoteness index from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So the study included 19,173 pregnancies from 18,414 women. We only used the first measure from each pregnancy to try and reduce any bias that may have been introduced from supplement intervention. So it was really evident when we looked at the data that among those who'd had multiple tests per pregnancy, the results following the first test were remarkably higher. And this was particularly evident for women who were deficient for their first test. So the observed increase from the initial and subsequent test results was too marked to be solely attributed to sun exposure in many cases, and was more likely attributed to a supplement intervention, and that's why we only took the first measure. So participants ranged in age from 18 to 43 years. Over half were Caucasian, with the remainder predominantly of Asian, Indian or African descent. The gestation of the women at the time of blood draw ranged between 0 and 41 weeks. The location of the women ranged all over Western Australia, so from 10.5 degrees to 34.5 degrees south latitude and 96.5 to 128.5 degrees east longitude. However, the majority, so 64%, resided in the Perth metropolitan area. And for those of you outside of Australia, that centres around 31.5 degrees south and 115.5 degrees east. So the sampling was equally distributed throughout the seasons, which was good. The median 25-OHD level was, as expected, highest in summer and autumn months. The serum 25-OHD concentration ranged from 5 to 255 nanomils per litre, with a median of 66 nanomils per litre. So for each blood collection date, we calculated the erythemal UV dose for each day up to 90 days prior to blood sampling, 3 and 7 day moving averages up to 90 days, the average for the last month, and the average for the last 42 days and 90 days. And then we ran regression analysis to determine which UVR measure best predicted 25-OHD levels. We found that the 90-day UVR explained the greatest variation of serum 25-OHD levels compared with all of the other UVR variables. So this is longer than the 40 to 60 days, which has been previously reported in Australian studies of non-pregnant women. We found that the 90-day UVR was in fact a significant predictor of 25-OHD levels, irrespective of maternal age, gestational age, and parity. In the final multivariate model, 20.3% of the variance in 25-OHD levels was explained by the included covariates. And importantly, this is a similar proportion of variance to that reported from small studies that have measured self-reported sun exposure and also accounted for sun protective behaviours of participants. So interestingly, as a side, not part of our study, but the commonly published positive association between self-reported time outdoors and hours spent in the sun evident in the general population has not been found to be significant in a number of studies of pregnant women. And similarly, in a recent Western Australian study of pregnant women, sunscreen, so as your predominant sun protective behaviour, again wasn't a significant predictor of 25-OHD levels. So the three key findings from this study were that the NASA's measure of erythemal daily dose is a significant predictor of 25-OHD levels in pregnant women. The UVR average over the 90 days prior to blood draw is the best predictor of 25-OHD levels in pregnant women. And a model using only administrative data was able to explain a similar proportion of variance to studies that accounted for individual level sun behaviour. So in conclusion, our study demonstrated that linked administrative data can be used to investigate associations between UVR in pregnancy and health outcomes in offspring. So these results were used to inform the studies focused on the role of UVR in type 1 diabetes pathogenesis. So the aim of the next study was to determine whether low levels of ambient UVR in the gestation period and the first year of life were associated with subsequent increased risk of type 1 diabetes in childhood. So the study was a nested case control study. So cases included all children who were born in Western Australia from 1980 to 2004 with a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes on the Western Australian Children's Diabetes Database. And the population-based controls were randomly selected from all live births in Western Australia from the midwives notification system, and they were matched to cases on both sex and date of birth. So these are the data sets that we used for the study. So data for the cases were obtained from the Western Australian Children's Diabetes Database, which is a prospective statewide registry maintained by the Perth Children's Hospital, and it includes over 99% of Western Australian children newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. The midwives notification system was used for the selection of the controls and also provided perinatal data on all of our participants. As the controls were selected on the basis of being alive at the age and time of diagnoses of our cases, the death registration data was necessary to identify who to validly include or exclude from the pool of controls. So the data linkage of the WA Children's Diabetes Database, the midwives notification system and the death registrations was performed by the WA linkage branch, and then date, location specific NASA satellite data were merged again on date and the latitude and longitude of the postcode that was recorded at the time of birth for the mother on the midwives notification system. So gestational UVR was calculated by summing the recorded daily erythemal UV dose over the days of each trimester, and then the first year of life we divided that into quarters, and the total UV dose were calculated for each quarter. The remoteness index and the index of social disadvantage and education occupation were again obtained from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and merged into the project data set on postcode. So of the 2,611 children with a record on the WA Children's Diabetes Database, 1,819 linked with the midwives notification system, so i.e. born in Western Australia, and the remaining perinatal records on the MNS were treated as non-cases. So cases were more likely to be Caucasian, born via caesarean section, which was evident for both elective and emergency caesarean sections, be of younger gestational age at the time of birth, have a mother with diabetes prior to pregnancy, so that doesn't include gestational diabetes, and reside in Perth, the metropolitan area. We found no differences between maternal age at time of delivery, birth weight, APGAR score, or birth order between the two groups. So we found no association between total UVR in the first or second trimesters and subsequent type 1 diabetes risk in childhood. In contrast, total UVR in the third trimester was significantly associated with type 1 diabetes risk. This is very consistent with previous studies looking at 25-OHD levels during pregnancy and also supplement studies. When we divided the UVR levels in the third trimester into quartiles, the risk of type 1 diabetes was 32% lower in offspring of women with UVR levels in the highest quartile during their third trimester compared with the offspring of women with levels in the lowest quartile. However, when we stratified by sex, we found a stronger effect in males than females. In fact, total UVR in the third trimester was significantly associated with reduced type 1 diabetes risk in males, but not at all in females. In boys whose mother was in the highest quartile for UVR in the third trimester, the risk of developing type 1 diabetes was 41% lower than boys of mothers in the lowest quartile. And so looking at the first year of life, so higher UVR in the first 12 months of life was associated with significantly decreased risk of type 1 diabetes in later life, and that was more pronounced in the period 3 to 6 months post-birth. Again, after stratifying by sex, no associations were observed between UVR and the first year of life and type 1 diabetes risk in females across any of the time periods that we investigated. For boys, total UVR in the first 6 months of life had a stronger effect than the UVR in the second 6 months of life, I should say. In the first 6 months of life, the relative risk of type 1 diabetes was reduced by 41% among boys whose total UVR was more than the median, compared with boys whose total UVR was less than the median. So in summary, higher levels of erythemal UVR in the third trimester and of pregnancy, so maternal exposure, and the first year of life were associated with a decreased risk for type 1 diabetes in childhood among boys. So in terms of where to next, further studies which prospectively measure UVR, dietary intake of vitamin D and 25-OHD levels are really needed to identify the preventative element, and further research is required to investigate why the association between erythemal UVR exposure and type 1 diabetes is only apparent in boys. So the final study looked at whether low 25-OHD levels at diagnoses are associated with increased risk of type 1 diabetes, age of disease onset, and presentation with ketoacidosis. So the aim of this study was to investigate whether there was an association between 25-OHD levels or vitamin D deficiency and type 1 diabetes risk could be demonstrated in Western Australia, a population that's known for its low rates of vitamin D deficiency among children. And then among cases specifically whether 25-OHD levels are associated with the age of onset of type 1 diabetes and severity of presentation as measured by diabetic ketoacidosis at the time of diagnoses. So to address these questions, a case control study and case series analysis were conducted, which utilised a sample of 169 children aged 0 to 16 years who were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in Western Australia. For cases, we limited our analysis to children who were diagnosed between 2011 and 2015, as this was a period of time where a random sample of children had their 25-OHD levels measured at the time of diagnoses. So samples were taken up to 10 days from diagnoses, although 95% were sampled within 4 days of hospital admission. All tests were conducted by Pathwest Laboratory based at the Perth Children's Hospital or the then Princess Margaret Hospital. The comparison group of 464 healthy children aged between 3 and 9 years who participated in a cross-sectional study on nutrition and DNA damage in Western Australia between 2009 and 2011. They were recruited through childcare centres, schools and community-based advertisements. So this slide shows the 5 pre-existing data sets that we obtained our data from. The top 2 provided data for our cases and controls, whilst the bottom 3 provided additional covariates for use in multiple regression analyses. So these data provided us with data on a large range of demographic and clinical measures. So 25-OHD levels, I should say, are commonly characterised into vitamin D status, in which levels less than 50 nanomils are generally considered as being deficient. However, the 50 nanomil cutoff that's commonly used to define vitamin D deficiency is actually based on skeletal health. And as there's limited evidence on what levels may be required to provide protection from autoimmune diseases, we considered 25-OHD levels as both a dichotomous and a continuous variable in all of our analyses. So the covariates that we used in multiple regression analyses were selected based on their relationship with 25-OHD levels as well as type 1 diabetes. So the final models were adjusted for age, sex, ethnicity, the BMI Z-score, season, CIFA indexes for both social disadvantage and education occupation, UVR and temperature. So when looking at the participant characteristics and comparing the 2 groups, there was an equal breakdown of sex in both populations, although we did see a higher proportion of Caucasians among cases than controls. As expected, the BMI Z-score was slightly higher among cases, and that was maintained after adjustment for age. Interestingly, the mean 25-OHD concentration of both cases and controls was within the range of sufficiency, although we did see a higher proportion of cases who were vitamin D deficient when compared with controls. So 27% of controls and 27% of cases compared with 7% of controls who were deficient. So after adjustment for all covariates, cases had levels on average 34% lower than controls, which at the overall mean of 81.5 equated to a difference of 28 nanomils per litre. And importantly, children who were vitamin D deficient had a 6.4 higher odds of having type 1 diabetes than children with sufficient levels. So this is looking at the case series analysis now. So we next investigated whether among cases specifically, 25-OHD levels were associated with the age of disease onset as an indicator of the role that 25-OHD levels may have on disease progression. So among all cases, there was no significant association between 25-OHD levels or deficiency with age of symptomatic disease in either unadjusted or adjusted analyses. We decided to conduct a fractional polynomial to test whether there was a cutoff other than 50 nanomils per litre that better predicted age of onset, or there was no threshold evident. Interestingly, when we stratified again by sex, as seen in figure A, a significant association was indicated between 25-OHD levels and age of onset among boys. So for each doubling of 25-OHD levels, we saw that the age of onset was nearly 2 years later. We found that the principal predictor of age of onset was actually the BMI-Z score. So for each, as you can see in figure B, for each standard deviation increase in BMI-Z score, we saw an 11-month younger age of onset on average. And then finally, in relation to disease severity, we found a significant association between 25-OHD levels and bicarbonate and pH levels at the time of presentation. The odds of presenting with DKA was more than 4 times higher among cases who were vitamin D deficient at the time of diagnosis when compared with those who were vitamin D sufficient. An important finding was that among cases with DKA at diagnosis, those who were deficient were on average 5.4 years younger than those who were vitamin D sufficient. One of the limitations that we had in this study is that we only had one measure per child, so we weren't able to compare the measurements of the same individual during DKA and then after resolution of the metabolic state. And as a result, we weren't able to elucidate whether the lower 25-HG levels contributed to the DKA risk or whether the acidotic state reduced the 25-HG levels. And when you look at the available literature, there's a suggestion that both possibilities may be plausible. In the present study, though, children with DKA were sampled between 0 and 5 days from diagnosis. So we were able to compare the 25-OHD levels of those who were sampled whilst acidotic and then those sampled post-metabolic resolution. And notably, we found no significant difference in the levels. So in summary, vitamin D deficiency was associated with an increased type 1 diabetes risk and among cases disease severity. Low 25-OHD levels were associated with younger age of onset among boys and for all cases those with DKA. In terms of where to next, as low 25-OHD levels may be a consequence of the disease process, again, prospective studies which periodically measure 25-OHD levels, UVR exposure, and dietary intake of vitamin D from early life would be well justified. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging the following people for their support of or involvement in this study. Thank you.